All right, folks, this is old news, but people on social media are now talking about using ibuprofen or aspirin for pain or fever during pregnancy, and that is not a good idea. Let's talk about this. The first thing I want to say about this whole thing is that this does not come out of nowhere. To be fair, there are studies that have shown an association between use of Tylenol in pregnancy and later development of neurodevelopmental problems like autism in the child. However, there are many other studies that have not shown that association, and that's how science works. You do a study, then you do it bigger, you do it better with better methods, and you have many studies that then you put together, and when you look at the data as a whole, studies that have done that have consistently concluded that exposure to Tylenol is not a significant risk factor for developing autism. And the big problem with all of these studies is that we are looking at an association. We are looking at what's called correlation, and correlation does not always equal causation. Two things may be related to one another, but it doesn't necessarily mean that one thing is causing the other. And one of the big challenges when you're trying to figure out correlation versus causation is that correlation is often subject to bias. The biggest source of bias when you're looking at this particular question around Tylenol exposure in utero and development of autism later in life is a confounder that we call confounding by indication. The indication for using the Tylenol itself confounds that possible association between the Tylenol and developing autism. And the indication is the illness that made you need the Tylenol. The illness that gave you fever, gave you pain, potentially an infection or inflammation. One can imagine that those things in the pregnant mother would influence the fetus, and those in themselves could be the cause of the autism as opposed to the Tylenol. And that is the major challenge in any research that has asked this question. The other challenge is that many studies have shown a very strong genetic predisposition to autism. So how do you disentangle then the genetic predisposition versus this possible environmental exposure relationship? The most important study is this Swedish study that looked at 2.5 million children in Sweden. And when they just looked at the kids exposed to Tylenol versus not exposed, they showed this very similar increased risk of autism in the children who had been exposed while the mother was pregnant. And then they did something really interesting. They limited their analysis to pairs of siblings, where one sibling had exposure to Tylenol while the mother was pregnant and the other sibling did not. And what that does is it controls for genetics because it's the same mother, but it also controls for the environment, other things in the environment during the pregnancy or later in the household that might have influenced the development of autism. All of those things are going to be very similar between siblings. The difference is going to be the Tylenol exposure in one sibling versus not in the other. And when they did that analysis, the association simply disappeared. In fact, it was the other way, where Tylenol seemed to be slightly protective from developing autism later in life. And that raises the question whether it's actually the fever and the pain and the illness that is causing the autism, and in fact has nothing to do with the Tylenol. And based on that study and others like it, the consensus in the scientific community and the medical community, whether it's the World Health Organization, the European Medicines Agency, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the Australian equivalent, the Canadian, the UK equivalent, all of these groups agree that there is no significant risk to Tylenol taken in pregnancy. And it's pretty easy for President Trump and his mantle to tell pregnant women to just suck it up and live through the pain and the fever, but that has consequences too. Fever in pregnancy is associated with miscarriages. It's associated with fetal organ malformations, including heart malformations. Pain during pregnancy leads to anxiety, leads to high blood pressure, over time can lead to depression in the mother. All of these things are bad for the fetus. And the biggest problem is that when people have pain and fever, they will need to turn to a medicine. And if you've taken Tylenol out of the mix, what will they turn to? And this is what we're seeing on social media. They're going to turn to NSAIDs, they're going to turn to aspirin, for example, they're going to turn to even stronger medications like opiates. And all of those have significant known and documented risks for the fetus. So there is no significant risk from Tylenol in pregnancy. And on the other hand, the alternatives are much worse. So if you're pregnant and you have pain or fever, please talk to your doctor.